It's my privilege to introduce our guest today, Dr. Roger Chevalier. I've followed Roger's work for years. This is his third webinar for OPWL. Whether we're talking about ISPI, AECT, ISPI, ATD, or other professional organizations, our standards call on IDs and performance improvement practitioners to collaborate with their clients. And wrangling clients can be tricky. Today, Roger will share hard-won tips and tricks for working with clients and responding to their often well-intentioned but ill-informed request for training. During our hour together, he'll describe how managers must own performance gaps, how to share work with managers to create descriptions of current and desired levels of performance. He'll provide rules for dealing with the monkeys on their back and offer different levels of performance solutions. He'll provide some real-world examples, and he'll also answer your questions. Roger, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Steve, and welcome to all of our participants out there. It's nice to see such a nice-sized group. Not that I can tell the difference, but that's a picture of me, mainly because I don't want you to see me in my San Francisco Giants sweatshirt this morning. And that's a picture of my book, which is probably the cheapest book you can buy in the field of management. You can buy them on Amazon for about $16, and it's usually the best-selling book at the conference, but it's probably because of the price. Somebody's got $20 left in their pocket, they'll usually pick that up. But it's a way of transmitting the ideas that we normally save for each other, meaning consultants, internal and external consultants, and translating them down to a level that a manager or supervisor can use. So it's got a different application level. We'll be talking at a different level during our hour here today because we're really talking as consultants. If you buy a book on Amazon, they have this lineup, that says people who bought this book, and they give you other recommendations. The only other recommendation I saw was this one. I don't know that the book is that good if we get the hangman's noose and a still to stand on. The worst part about teaching a webinar, I can't tell whether you're laughing or not. Okay, what we're going to do, we've already talked about the session outline, and we're going to talk about performance gaps and how that's the most critical aspect of the consulting process, is getting the manager or supervisor, whoever we're working with, to define their problem in a clear way with measurable results. We're going to talk about monkey management rules and the kind of the care and feeding of monkeys. There was a great article by the man by the name of Unken years ago who talked about the care and feeding of monkeys, and I've got one more that I add to it for our consultants. We're going to talk about different levels of performance solutions. In other words, training is one level, but there are many others. We'll talk a little bit about consulting versus selling. And those two are really the same thing, whether you realize it or not. And then we're going to talk about real-world examples. We'll do that as I go through, but we'll highlight them even more at the end. But as Steve said, I'll take questions at any time, and we'll stop, maybe not after every slide, but certainly after each section that I present, so that we can get the questions in and make them time relevant for you people. I'm going to send you a couple of different things right after this. One is an article that you may have already read, which is the 2003 article, Updating the Behavior Engineering Model. I used to teach in the Principles and Practices course for ISPI, and we used to use Gilbert's model, and it was just terribly out of shape. It had been just a lot of archaic terms in it, and so I set out to revise it. And one thing I'll recommend, if you're going to revise the work of a guru, make sure they've been dead for at least 5 years, and this way you don't get any haunting presence from them. And then the other thing I'm going to give you is a book chapter I wrote for Marshall Goldsmith's book, and it's Situational Leadership and Performance Coaching, and I wrote that with Paul Hersey. He's of Paul Hersey and Ken Blanchard, the developers of Situational Leadership. I had the pleasure of studying under both of them for about 5 or 6 years a number of years ago. And then on my website, www.about.IWP, which the IWP stands for Improving Workplace Performance.com, you'll find, I guess there's 6 articles and this same book chapter are on there that you can download for free. You don't have to register or anything silly. You just go in there to that website and go to articles and resources, and you'll see the articles that you can download for free. But they're some of my better articles that are in there. So, okay, we're going to start by talking about a performance gap, and this is something that a lot of people talk about in different ways, and so I'm going to give you kind of my version. All of this stuff is kind of my take on how to use the ideas that have been developed over time, but when we're talking about a performance gap, we're talking about the difference between a present level of performance, or how I like to call it, where we are, and where we'd like to be, the desired level of performance. In reality, every day a manager comes into their office and takes a look at performance and sees the present level of performance and know there's a desired level of performance, and they establish a performance gap in their own minds. But one thing that's usually missing is the idea of adding a reasonable goal to this process, where let's say your performance gap is, say, a 5-year gap, and I work with one company whose market share had fallen tremendously over a 10-year period. It had dropped from about 11% down to about 4.5%, and it had dropped at about 0.5% a year. This is not a good sign for an organization. And but the idea of trying to regroup that 7% would have been, not motivating for anybody. It's just too big a gap. And what I did when I was working with the management team was we set a reasonable goal in terms of what could we get done in the next year. And in reality, it wasn't even improving the performance gap. It was leveling off this constant drop. In other words, keep it at 4.5% for a year and then start to rebuild afterwards by laying the foundations during this year. So it's that combination of a performance gap and setting of a reasonable goal. Are there any questions at this point, Steve?
Yes, I have one. Roger, in my experience, we can often trust clients to know some things about their performance gaps and be kind of ignorant about others. What guidelines do you use to separate what clients really know and what they think they know?
Well, I'll give you an example from a company I work with who had a terrible problem with retention of their people. And I asked the question, well, what is your retention rate? And they really didn't know. And I had done my homework and already had the industry rate, so I could tell them what that was. But I said, before we can go any further, we're really going to have to define this present level of performance. Who you're losing, how many you're losing, and where they're going to are all going to be critical aspects of the way we're going to resolve the problem. So the big thing is that they usually feel pain and they have some understanding that there's a problem, but very often they don't have it in measurable terms. And there was a line from about 1893 by Lord Kelvin, William Thompson. He was presenting at a quality conference, and he said, "You can't improve it if you can't measure it." And so, coming up with measurable terms, measurable ideas for the two endpoints, where we are, where we like to be, and at a minimum for the reasonable goal, that has to be in measurable terms. You're not going to be able to improve the situation. But that's the most common problem, is they think they understand the problem. In this case, it was retention, but didn't have it clearly defined in any way, and therefore we couldn't move forward from that point. Anything else?
That mirrors my experience too, where they know that there's a problem. They're not necessarily sure what the measures would be that would indicate when they've solved the problem or seized the opportunity. And this idea of a reasonable goal is important too, because quite often, when they think about the sources of their pain, The measures are all or nothing, and very few organizations have the ability to make sure that they have perfect reliability. There's actually a level that they can live with as a reasonable goal, right?
Yeah, that's true. The thing that I'd say about this is that by defining the performance gap clearly and defining it in measurable terms, you've set up your methodology for evaluating whether or not your intervention was successful. If you haven't done this at the beginning, very hard to reconstruct it at the end. I remember someone coming up to me one time when I was teaching a workshop on evaluation and said, we've had this leadership program around in our company for a couple of years. How can we measure its impact? And I said, well, how did you define the performance gap at the beginning? What was it that you were trying to resolve? And they said, we didn't do that. And I said to them, then there's probably no way that you can measure the impact of the training you're providing. This is a critical aspect, whether you're defining a true performance intervention or just a training intervention. If you're going to be able to measure the impact of what you've done, you need to define these things up front.
Roger, Ross asks, Gilbert wrote that he believed that an average performer could be improved to the performance of an exemplary performer. In his material, I've always thought that the desired level of performance should be set at that exemplary level. Based on what you're saying in this slide, it seems like in practice you're setting interim goals is probably better. Can you comment on this?
Well, I think that if you want to get to the exemplary level, people can't go from average to exemplary. We need to define what exemplary is, and again in measurable terms, and then set reasonable goals so that they can show progress and that in their minds they think they can achieve it. There was a good example of this goal setting process that was given at an ISPI conference by a couple of consultants from the Netherlands, and they were working with the Netherlands swim team from the northern part of the Netherlands, and what they found was that their best swimmer in this 100-meter freestyle was a full 2 seconds off of the last world record and the last Olympics gold medal run. And but this in an event that only takes a minute to run, actually less than a minute to run. This was not something that was going to motivate the swimmers. It was just too big a gap for people. 2 seconds was too big a gap. And the other thing, they knew that over the next 3 years that swimmers would improve and the gap was probably more like 3 seconds. And so what they did was they took the 3 seconds, they had 3 years, they divided it by 150 weeks, which is the number of training weeks they had in the 3-year period, and came out with a figure like 0.02 seconds a week. And the swimmers believed that they could improve by that small amount every week. And some weeks they'd improve more than that, some weeks they wouldn't improve at all, but the bottom line was it was a reasonable goal that they could strive for. So we set these smaller goals so that we can work them towards the highest goal. But I'll tell you, you could take an average swimmer and use this goal setting process and you're not going to turn them into an Olympic gold medal winner. Then that should be your exemplar level. I think that what we want to do is bring them to a level that we are truly satisfied with the level of performance. And they may not be as good as the best, but they're better than what they were. And so I'm not looking to take people and make them exemplars. I'm trying to bring them along the line so at least their performance is at an acceptable level. I mean, that's my own theory on it. Good question.
Ross says, thank you, that's helpful. And I have a follow-up question. When clients come to you and they begin the conversation with a request for training, how do you respond in a way that lets you talk about desired and present levels of performance and reasonable goals?
Well, first of all, when someone comes to you with a request for training as a solution, don't deny them that. Don't tell them you don't think that's a good idea or anything else. But normally what you would move to, if you were just a straight trainer, would be saying that, well, if we're going to provide training, we need to do a needs assessment, which means we have to take a look at the ability and willingness and motivation of your people to do the task at hand. And, we're used to doing that as trainers. But what we must learn how to do, is ask or state the question that, there's only so much that we can provide in training, but it needs to be reinforced when they go back to their jobs. And unreinforced training is not going to have the impact that we're looking for. So are there any things in the environment that we can change that will enhance the transfer of what we've taught them in the classroom back to the workplace? In other words, start with the training solution and work more towards a performance solution. But I have it later on in my presentation, but I'll address it a little bit now, that when I get a request for training and I have to write a proposal for it, I usually give them back an A, B, and C solution. The A solution would be what they ask for. This is what the training is, and this is what it'll cost you, and this is how long it'll take to develop, and all those neat things about a training solution. Then I'll give them a B solution, which will have some aspects of performance improvement in it, and then a C version, which would be the most expensive solution, but would have the full-blown intervention, including different ways of shaping the environment to support the training. And let them make the decision. I got that question when I was in charge of certification of CPTs for ISPI, and it was an ethics question that one of the CPTs asked. What if we know that training isn't going to give them the solution, but that's all they want? And I've always told people to give them the A, B, and C, and let them make an informed decision that there's more than they can get, but it's going to cost more to do, and it's going to take more time to develop, but it will give you the solution you're looking for. And I've walked away from strictly training jobs and told them that when you find out that the training really didn't work, give me a call and I'll see if I can straighten out the mess that you've created. But I'm at a point in my career where I only work with people I like on projects that have a high chance of success. And that's a nice place to be, because I turn down work because they're too short-sighted and only want training as a solution. Okay, I'd like to move on a little bit so we get... I liked all the questions. That's super. And what I present is really just to give us a structure to work from, and then we get the questions from that. So that was just a super step. The next thing that we do is we look at the driving and restraining forces, the things working for us and working against us in closing this performance gap. And if you look at the article that we're going to send to you, the 2003 article, it takes you through this and gives you a performance aid for doing this, and gives you a structure for doing the cause analysis part of what we do. So we initially do the gap analysis, then we have to do a cause analysis, and that article will work you through the other steps. But we're staying strictly on the performance gap at this point. One of the things that Unken doesn't address when he talks about monkey management, he has 4 steps that are super, but I'm not going to go through all 4 of them. But it's really just a question of who owns the monkey. When a manager comes in to your office and says they want a training solution, they're trying to take the monkey off of their back, meaning poor performance, and put it on your back. And let's say you do that. You supply them with a training solution, and it doesn't have the impact that they were looking for. Whose fault is it? Now it's your fault. You were in charge of the care and feeding of that monkey by developing the training solution, and now the monkey is dead, and it's your fault. So you've got to remember that the problem, the monkey, always has to remain with the manager. You're not there to take that problem away from the manager. You're there to partner with them in resolving that but they control the work environment, and the work environment controls more about performance than anything you're going to do with training. So it's the balance between what you can provide and the knowledge and skills that you bring to the equation and the work environment that the manager controls. And you have no control over that other than to guide them and to give them ideas as to what's wrong with the environment and maybe how they can remedy that. So that's my monkey management rule. If you take the monkey off their back, you're now responsible for it, and if it dies, you're going to be criticized for it. Whereas at the beginning, you should tell them that training is only as good as the work environment the trainees go back to, and that's their responsibility. Questions?
Yes, this is Steve again. I'm wondering what ways do you steer a conversation that starts with, you're thinking, they're trying to put the monkey on my back. And while you may be thinking about where the monkey needs to go, you're also talking with them. What are the phrases or what are the talking points that you use to change the conversation from take my monkey to we need to work together on this?
Well, the one phrase I've already used, and it's critical to the conversation, is that the training that we would provide is only as good as the work environment that you create. And that keeps the monkey where it's supposed to be, that you have responsibility for developing the training. That's your part of the equation. There's no problem in taking that on. So you should admit to that, but then you should also focus on the fact that the work environment. I worked for a company that had 60,000 salespeople, and they were in 5,000 different offices, and that's 5,000 different work environments. And somehow I needed to reach all of those managers so that they would be in a position to reinforce the training I was to provide, because my training was only as good as that work environment. Matter of fact, if the work environment had been right, they would never have needed the training. We were trying to make up for the fact that they weren't doing training themselves, and they weren't coaching their people, and they weren't setting goals, and they weren't doing the things necessary to encourage performance. So the way I got around that was we ended up not allowing the managers to send their people to the training, the sales training, until they went through one day of training on how to communicate expectations to these people ahead of time and what to reinforce when they came back from the training. And so it was building it into the process. The only way I could approach 5,000 different office environments was to train 5,000 brokers or sales managers so that they were in a better position to coach these people. So we taught them leadership, we taught them coaching, but we also taught them what we were teaching their people and where they should intervene to make it happen, and so that they take responsibility for that work environment. So it's that balance between what you can do, which is design and come up with great training programs, but those training programs are only as good as the work environment that either supports them or will tear them down. What does a person do when they've gone through training and they go back with these ideas as to what they should be doing, and their boss says, that may be what they told you, but that's not how we do it here. Training will not have the impact that you're looking for. Good questions. Follow-up or another question?
There's no follow-up.
Good. Okay, well, just get the idea across that, in your own minds, that you're not there to take the monkey off their back. You're there to supply the training that they want. And I've been involved in the performance business for quite a few years, and I've never had an intervention that didn't have some training involved in it. It wasn't the focal point, but there was always some training necessary because roles were going to change, what we're going to reinforce was going to change, expectations were going to change, and training was a good way of communicating those changes. So training is almost always part of a performance solution. At the same time, it's not the end-all solution, so you've got to keep that in mind as you work with your clients. Good. Just want to talk about the consulting process because a lot of people, really don't understand what they should be doing as a consultant, either an internal or an external consultant. The first phase is preparation. When you get a call from somebody in your company or from a company that you're going to work with, depending on whether you're an internal or an external consultant, the next thing that you want to do before you ever meet with them is do your homework. You want to prepare for that meeting. I'm usually an external consultant. I've been an internal consultant in my career in the Coast Guard and my second career with Century 21 Real Estate, but I've been primarily an external consultant. And, my preparation involves the web quite a bit. I'll want to see, learn as much as I can about the company, get a look at their annual report that they have to submit. If they're a stock producing company, then they produce an annual report so I can see what they're communicating to their stakeholders. And, in general, I'll start to research these people, research the name of the person that I'm going to meet with. Sometimes they'll show up, and check for news articles about that organization. But basically, you got to do your homework. If you're inside the company, you can talk to other people, maybe people in your own division who may have worked with that individual or with that division, but find out as much as you can about that division. Do your homework, do your preparation, because if you don't do your preparation, it's going to show when you start to ask your questions. The next step is kind of an assessment stage where you build some rapport when you walk into their office for the first time. Try to find things that you can talk about with them, and then you ask your open-ended questions as to why you were there. And the way I usually build rapport is I scan the office very quickly to see what things they've put out, which allow them to be topics of discussion. I remember one company down in the East Bay. I live north of San Francisco. But when I was invited into the gentleman's office, he was on the phone and just waved me into his office, and I looked around, and he had a picture of him with a Little League team. So he was obviously the coach. And I had coached 39 youth sports teams between my two sons. And so we had a lot to talk about just to build rapport. And it turns out what I was trying to sell his organization was a program for sales managers to coach their people. So even the topic was relevant, and it allowed us to build the rapport that was necessary. So you build rapport and then ask an open-ended question like, why did you invite me here today? Or what seems to be the problem that you want to address? Something open-ended to get the conversation going. When they respond to the open-ended questions, that gives you permission to diagnose. That gives you permission to drill down in every area that they've told you about. And if you don't drill down, you're actually insulting them. So you want to make sure you're listening. You want to make sure you're taking a few notes as to the topics that they're bringing up. And that then you go to the next phase, which is the diagnostics phase, where you drill down. Then the next step after that, you're going to go in and give a summary of what you've learned, and then give a proposal of what you should be doing. And very often that proposal is that you need to do more assessment, but sometimes there's a ready solution that you can go to. After that, you partner with them and make sure they understand their role and you understand your role. Then you reinforce them after for making the decision to go with you, and then you follow up with them. So the process is really just this whole 7-step process of preparation, assessment, diagnosis, prescription, partnering, reinforcement, and follow-up. I've laid this out using situational leadership as a basis for the model, and the article we're going to send you will have this diagram in it, but it's a performance consulting guide, and it gives you the different steps in terms of preparation and breaks it down in the amount of direction and support you're going to give them, just like situational leadership gives you things in terms of direction and support. And then we go to assessment and how we build our rapport and personal power and how we probe with open-ended questions, and we listen and take notes, and then We diagnose by following up, and sometimes we move back and ask another open-ended question and follow up with a more direct question. Identify the present and desired levels of performance in that box, and identify the causes. So a lot gets covered in our diagnostic phase. And then we prescribe, we tell them what we think we should be doing. We partner with them. And then we reinforce and we follow up. The way I usually reinforce is I tell them that I've worked with a company or with another division that had a similar problem. This is what we did and this is what the return was. Make them feel comfortable that they think I know what I'm doing. Sometimes you have to do that with a little sleight of hand. I remember one time I was waiting to go in to see a general manager about a sales program, and the marketing director said to me that my competition was Spin Selling, a program from there, and did I know what that was about? And I said, sure. I quickly made a phone call to my partner. I said, what the hell is Spin Selling? And he told me it covers our boxes 2 and 3 and 4, but that's it. Doesn't cover the rest of it. And that's all I really needed to know to talk with the general manager. And said, I'll not only give you the 3 things that Spin Selling will give you, but I'll prepare them better and then reinforce everything after the fact. So sometimes you got to work quickly to make sure you've got the solution they're looking for. But we don't always go just straight through this process. We sometimes we'll jump off and go directly from diagnostic to partnering. If we work with them before, we may not have to give them a full prescription. Sometimes we go from diagnosis to reinforcement. We realize that we're not the right person to give them the solution. And we tell them you've got a great problem and here's some people who might be able to help you, but this isn't in my field. And the same thing is true when we're doing our assessment phase. So it gives us jump off points for getting out of the picture. This model and situational leadership and how to use this model are all in the article. It's actually a book chapter that we're going to send to you. Questions about the consulting process?
Yes, we've got a couple. Adam and I were both struck with some of the parallels between the consulting model and, in particular, Darlene Van Teen et al.'s model of performance improvement.
Sure.
And Adam specifically asks, is performance consulting another term for needs assessment, or is the assess step, your second one, the needs assessment?
I would say this whole process and the name of the consultant form that I use, it's an article that's on my website. It's called The Evolution of a Performance Aid. It's an upgraded version of the force field analysis worksheet that's in the 2003 article. But I call that guide that's in there a performance assessment. And if you just do cause analysis, that's a cause assessment. If you do needs assessment, that's just knowledge and skills and motivation. So there are different types of assessments, and the performance consulting guide that I use and that Darlene uses is really centered on a performance assessment, which takes into account the work environment, not just the knowledge and skills of the people that are doing the job. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I can also see some parallels in terms of the prepare, mapping back to the environmental scan and knowing who the workers, the workplace, the organization is.
Sure. Yeah, there were overlaps, yeah.
And I can certainly see assess and diagnose being part of performance analysis as you start working into follow-up, reinforce partner, being intervention, selection, design, etc. But these dovetail pretty well.
Yeah.
It's probably by design. Ha!
Well, the problem with that, I think it's more coincidental that we're both looking at different parts of the elephant. The old story about four blind men find an elephant, and one's got his leg, and he says it's big, it's round, it's like a column. Another one's got its tail and says it's thin and it's got hair on it. Another one's got the tusk and says there's no hair on it. We're all looking at the same elephant, but I actually designed this model a couple of years before Darlene came out with hers. And I don't think she stole from me. I didn't steal from her. I think it's coincidental that we're both looking at the same performance assessment idea and coming up with different ways to address it.
Yes, our models are representations of reality, and often our perceptions are a function of what part of the elephant we're holding on to.
Right. And so I was looking at it from the point of view of the process the consultant goes through. She was looking at it with, I would say, a broader brush than I was looking at it, and which is good. People are surprised when I come up with good questions when they've told me what their problems are, and it's because I have these different models in my head, and they've only given me parts of the answers to the models, so I know to go back and explore the other ones. This is why you have to have these models memorized and in your mind, that you understand the steps that are necessary for them to be successful. And you listen to them, and if they don't cover, certain areas, that's where you got to go back and ask your questions. And then they realize that they haven't covered those areas as well, and that's how you change their point of view. You change it not by telling them things, but by asking questions that makes them think about things differently. Other questions?
I have a related question. Many of our students are junior or mid-level IDs or personnel in organizations that are often order takers for training. Kathy Moore called them training shops.
Yeah.
I can see that doing the initial homework is a really good starting point, because you need to know what's going on and where the opportunities and the sources of pain are. Once you've done that homework, what are the talking points that have helped you get permission with these folks to have that initial meeting where you're assessing and diagnosing?
Well, again, it's explaining to them how important the work environment is, and that, that my role as a trainer is not to change that environment. As a trainer, I'm there to supply knowledge and skills and maybe a little bit of motivation to your people to go out and do the jobs as they're required. But that they're responsible for the work environment. I don't have the slide here, but I gave this presentation to McDonald's, and there was the Senior Vice President for Global Training and Development in the room. And he took my models and he converted them into a pie-shaped model that showed how little training is. And I'll see if I can find I know I can find a slide of it, but I'll send it to you. And I use that model sometimes with them to, like he did. He went to their 6 hamburger universities around the world and showed them their role was in this training small slice of the pie, and how much was the information that these people received, the equipment and time and materials, the resources they receive, and also what gets measured and what gets reinforced was all part of the manager's responsibility, and that was the lion's share of the performance issues. But it's a good model to take a look at, because it shows it very graphically that the work environment is far more critical than the training that you're going to provide. And it's getting them back around to thinking about that work environment and what they can do to improve it. And that you can play a hand in assessing that work environment if they'd like for you to do that. Other questions?
No, thank you.
Okay, we're moving on a little bit. One thing that I found was that all of these models that I derived from situational leadership can deal with the selling process, the team building process, the service process, as long as we look at the situation, the performance gap, and do our cause analysis, which fits into the top part of that diagram. But if we think about selling, and I call it consultative selling. Here's the model for that. You'll notice that the terms at the head of each box, prepare, assess, diagnose, prescribe, then reinforce and follow up, are exactly the same as the consulting model, but the word close is in that bottom diagram there because that's what salespeople do. They close on issues at that point. They close on the sale. So that's the major difference between this as a consulting model and as a selling model. And then if you go to Neil Rackham's book, if you ever wanted the best book on questioning techniques for a consultant or for a salesperson, pick up the book Spin Selling. It's a little bit old, but it's a great book. Neil Rackham did a lot of work with IBM and Xerox in the 70s and into the 80s, training their salespeople and assessing the work environment and how it contributed to transfer of knowledge. But he used the word spin to capture people's minds. It really should be SPIV or SPIP. And if you see there are need payoff questions at the end, it should just be payoff questions or value questions, but then it would be SPIP or SPIV, and he wanted to spell spin. So that's how it became need payoff. But he has situation questions, problem questions, implication questions, and need payoff questions. You want to become a better questioner and learn how to lead your clients with questions. Read Spin Selling. It is a great book. It focuses on the selling process. And one line that I'll never forget in there, he says with new salespeople, they make the mistake of asking too many situation questions because they haven't prepared properly. New consultants do the same thing. They can tell whether you're prepared, and they give you points if you're already prepared when you walk in the door, rather than wasting their time with things that you should already know. So, any questions on the selling model?
Chet notes that there's a great video with Neil Rackham at Motorola that Guy Wallace has posted.
Oh, wonderful.
Thing that strikes me again is the mapping of spin against performance improvement models. So the situation questions, again, mapping to an environmental scan and knowing what's going on. The problem and questions being things that are getting at statements of performance gaps, and the implication and the payoff questions being things that are part of an organizational analysis in terms of why would a client value closing this performance gap. Did I get that right?
Yeah. No, all good. Neil spoke at our ISPI conference a number of years ago. I think it was the one in Boston. And I tracked him down because I started using the spin selling, the spin questions. And I gave a presentation at the ASTD conference one year. And there were about, 800 people in the room. And one of them was a certified spin selling instructor. And he reported me to the group that owned Neil Rackham's materials. Neil didn't own it anymore. And they sent me a 5-page, all in legal terms, a cease and desist document. And I wrote back to them, I showed them my handout, and then I was really marketing their material by giving credit to the spin selling book and where to find it and how to buy it and what have you. And that I said it was a half a page out of a 10-page handout. I don't think I was compromising anything, and I gave you full credit for it. And they wrote back and they said, well, I can understand, well, you can continue to use it that way. And I said, I won't bother using it that way because you didn't assess before you intervened. And I can't live with organizations that do that. And then I developed my questions of going to situations and then looking at the problem and the causes. So the gap in the causes. So that's what forced me to move over into that diagram. So it's interesting how these things evolve. Oh, I see you've got the reference up here in the questions here. That's great. One other thing I'll tell you, Guy has done some tremendous work in putting different programs up. If you go to my website, the front page has got a link to a presentation I did in the 2012 ISPI conference, and Guy was good enough to tape that for me. He's done some amazing things for ISPI, and I can't say enough good about the work that he does for all of us in this profession. Okay, this one I've already addressed. What if a client asks for a training solution you see for a need for a more comprehensive performance intervention? And this is where I talked about having the A, B, and C proposals. In other words, having a proposal with 3 different levels. Yeah, you want training. Here's the pros, the cons, and the cost. Training plus some environmental changes to support the training, and then a full-blown performance intervention. And, at that point, you're off the hook. If they just still want training after that, you've done your due diligence for them. You've told them what else could be done. You've told them what should be done, and they've chosen the cheaper of all of these things. And if you still want the work, you can take it. But if you don't do this, then you've got an ethical issue. They wanted this. I knew it wouldn't do the job, but I did it anyway. So that's how I address that type of a question. Any questions on this, now that you've kind of seen it on the chart?
Chet Stevenson notes that he calls this that I've called this the consultant's backsteps shuffle, where you start with the most optimum and then step backwards to the next best and backwards to the next best and so on.
Yeah, well, I always start with what they ask for and move forward and show them what the value add is at each level. And but you could start at either end. That's not a problem.
You've got a forward shuffle and I've got a backward shuffle.
Well, okay, we got to do the shuffle together. As long as we don't end up with a salsa shuffle, we're okay. All right, going to move along to the next slide. We're getting down there at this point. And that's my website. There was supposed to be a thank you up here in this box, but somehow it disappeared. But it's on the website. There's information about the courses I teach and what have you, but the section that all of you should be interested in is the articles and resources. You'll find that all of them are drafts of the articles. Once you publish an article, you no longer own that article. The publisher owns it. In this case, ISPI initially, and now Wiley owns all of our articles. And, you're supposed to buy those articles. But I got permission to put my own drafts up. Anytime you submit an article for publication, copyright it. Just put your name at the bottom, copyright the year and your name, and that's what's called a common law copyright, and that gives you the right to use the draft that you submit on your own. And so what you've got is the final draft of all the articles, which are actually better than the articles because they chop up the articles, and sometimes I have a full-page performance aid, and they'll make it smaller. And so I like the drafts better anyway because the different diagrams are embedded right where they're supposed to be, not see figure 3 on page 6. It's right there where it's supposed to be. So the drafts of the articles are there, and the full-blown version of the aids are there. So, and if you go to my website also, the performance aids for the book are all on one PDF if you wanted to download them. They have a lot of neat exercises in there. Each chapter in the book ends with an exercise for a manager's supervisor to do, and those are all real good exercises to get these points across. So, any other questions that I might be able to help you with? Anything at all?
You mention a manager and his supervisor and the importance of the ongoing conversation they have after training is over. Is that something that you also negotiate up front as part of that initial discussion with them?
Yeah.
Say, I can provide the training, but if it's going to transfer to the workplace environment, there's some other things that need to happen.
Yeah, and then I also throw in at that point that I'm prepared to actually talk with your people and assess what else needs to change in order for the training to be effective. And if you're an internal, you just throw that in. If you're an external, if you're doing your job right, you can get them to pay for that. But at a minimum, it's good practice for the first couple that you do to do a performance assessment rather than just a basic needs assessment. So you will learn from it. There's got to be a payoff for everything you do. And a lot of times the payoff for me is just learning how to do something differently than I did before.
Do we
You'll have to pardon me today. Steve knows that I suffer from incredible back problems. I'm not in too bad a pain situation today, but if my speech sounds a little slow, I think it might be some of the pain meds that are working on my brain. All good things.
Do we have other questions for Roger? I'm going to wait and give people a little bit of time.
Okay.
While people are typing, I do want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today and sharing your expertise with us.
Always a pleasure.
Lisa says thank you, and Ross says thank you. This has been great.
Well, it's always a pleasure. You people are the future of our profession. I'm the tail end of it at this point. I've had a good run, and my goal now is to share my information. That's why I wrote so many articles. I've written 20 articles for just performance improvement, the journal, just for that journal alone. And, I write for trade journals and other things as well. But, my goal now is to share my information. I learned that from one of my mentors, Marshall Goldsmith, who wrote the foreword for my book. If you don't know his name, he's the foremost coach in the United States, probably in the world, as an executive coach. And he gets paid rather well for what he does. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it's because he's as good as he is and the level that he works at. The people he works with are making more than $1 million a year and can afford a coach like him. But he's been a tremendous mentor over the years, and now he's put everything he owns on his websites for people to download and to use. And I'm slowly doing that.
And Adam says, thank you for sharing. It was a pleasure. Catherine said, thank you so much, Dr. Chevalier. Wonderful presentation.
Well, if you ever meet me, my name is Roger. Somehow, if I get called doctor, I think I should have a little black bag with me and take your temperature or do something like that. But I've had many different titles in my life. The one that I still allow people to use for me are all the kids I coached over the years. When I run to them different places, they always yell, "Hey, coach." That's one title I allow them to keep on using. Even when I go out to the Coast Guard base, people will want to call me commander, and I said, that ended 30 years ago when I retired. So, in any event, Roger's the first name, and I react much better to that than anything else, but thank you.
And Ross wrote, your book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, was great, and he said, thanks again.
Yeah, that's Marshall Goldsmith's book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. It is a tremendous book. It shows us how our success can limit us, and the things that we did to get to this point may actually limit us from getting ahead. A good example would be that some managers micromanage, and as they get more senior, they have to learn how to delegate or they'll die. And so, that would be one example of what got you here won't get you there. You may be good at micromanagement, but as you get higher in the organization, you need to be able to delegate or it'll kill you. And I show the signs of stress as I went through that transition years ago. And I always said that change agents will either come with thick skin or will develop a lot of scar tissue. I was the latter of the two, till I learned a little bit more about how to take a blow. So any other questions, comments, sarcastic remarks?
No, not anymore. You've addressed everything. And again, Roger, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us.
My pleasure, really, and I wish you all the best in your academic careers there. I know that Boise State prepares people well. I still meet with the Coast Guard officers out on the base, and there are a few of them that are uh, graduates of Boise State. I know you've got a couple of them there right now. And yeah, Tony Markham was coming through the area, and we had lunch out there with all the Coast Guard officers. And it's, it's a great program you're going through, and you're very fortunate to have it. Years ago, I don't have a degree in performance improvement. I don't have a degree in instructional design. Mine's in applied behavioral science, which lends itself to this, but I had to learn all of this from my people. And, I think the future in management is not in inventing new things, but in showing the overlaps between them, like what Steve did with talking about Darlene's model and my model. I agree that they do overlap, but never really thought about it in those terms before. And I think that's the future in what we do, is not invent new, but capitalize on what we already know and integrate it. So that's your jobs coming up. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody, and enjoyed my time with you. Bye now.
Thank you very much, everybody. This ends our OPWL Talking Shop webinar. Thank you for your interest. Goodbye now.